Hello everyone. I'm going to be talking to you about the future forward scenarios between now and 2050 for the French pork industry. Given the current environment, there are 6 planetary limits or boundaries that we have already met due to climate change. And because of that, there is strong political commitments being made. For example, in France, carbon neutrality, well, that's France and Europe, between now and 2050. So given that political commitment and pledges being made, now things have to be put into action plans. So we have to rethink the farming systems that we have, but we also need to rethink the way we eat. And all of that is covered in prospective and forecasting work, which is currently being done by a number of people. And in those various forecasts, they plan on a drop of pork production between 10 and 70%. And that is based on the forecasting hypotheses. So we wanted to take these forecasts and use that to come up with a new action plan. But the thing is, there are different ways to interpret it, because in those various forecasts, there are certain choices that are made which are indissociable from one from the other. There is little understanding of the technical means that farmers have at their disposal to change the way they operate. And there are also some priorities which actually don't work hand in hand. For example, if you try and improve work on the environment, then you're actually going to be impeding upon the work to improve animal welfare. So you have to pick one or the other. So we wanted to focus on the volume, the national volume of pork product, the type of pork production, the actual extent to which best practices are being rolled out, and the way French people eat pork-based products. The idea of this was to try and give some key guidelines to mainland France and pork farmers in mainland France, to give them ideas on what they can do between now and 2050 to be in line with those forecasts that I was talking about earlier. So we've got the different variables we looked at. The first variable is the level of production. There is current level of production, 110% of covering 110% of French eating needs, a drop of 18% production, so that is a more pessimistic view, and then there's a production level which is very much in line with the French national low carbon strategy, which is to drop overall farming carbon emissions between now and 2050. Then we looked at the rollout of organic farming. So there's the current level, and there's one option we looked at where there's a 50% organic farms. Again, this is something that we saw come up in the various forecasts. Now, in terms of best practices, best environmental practices in farming being rolled out, so there's the current level, and then there's the maximum level. That's what we call BPE+. And the final scenario or the variable we're looking at is the way we eat. So the first way is looking at current consumer practices, and the second option was looking at a 20% reduction of pork-based product consumption. Now, for this, we looked at your stock standard farm. We looked at Agribalise, which is a French organization that qualifies the types of farms we're working with. And then we also looked at the types of farms that follow the Egypt type system, which is again a French-based system. And we wanted to look at the total inflows and the total number of sows, because that gives us a better understanding of the overall production levels. So we wanted to look at zero soy, which was 0% deforestation. We want to look at the best environmental practice in terms of the construction, the buildings, and then we wanted to look at the storage and treatment, and we also wanted to look at the effluent treatment and processing where it was spread. Now, as you can see, there are some of these best practices already being rolled out, but what's interesting is when you look at the BPE+, because you can really increase the levels, and for some of them you can even get these bars right up to 100%. To assess the very scenario, we looked at a few key indicators. First, we want to look at a greenhouse gas emissions assessment. Then we want to look at the overall coverage of pork-based product consumer practices. Then we look at additional costs implementing these best practices. Then we also looked at ammonia direct emissions, and then we also looked at the overall surface area needed to feed these pigs. Quick overview of the carbon footprint. So this incorporates all types of greenhouse gas emissions coming from pork production. So here you have the farm, here you have the feed input. So either it's locally produced or produced further afield. So it's imported. And we wanted to also look at the import, if we had to import, and then because you're going to have a drop in production, you need to import more pigs. But with the production, you also have less manure. Less manure means less fertilizer. So we also had to look at the import to replace that drop in fertilizer production. And then we also want to look predominantly at what was happening in France for part of our study, because that's what the national CO2 plan looks at. We also wanted to look at the downstream impact by looking at the two key scenarios, where there's an 110% consumption compared to a negative 18% in production. We looked at 134 currently existing slaughterhouses in France, looking at their location and looking at their supply chains. Then we also calculated the financial health of the various slaughterhouses in both scenarios. Now, if ever the use rate of the slaughterhouse was under 60 to 65%, we said that it was not a profitable slaughterhouse. And if it was ever above 100%, we said it was overcapacity. And in both cases, we looked at the percentage of slaughterhouses that fell in those two criteria, and then looking at the level of or the number of animals being slaughtered in the local area. I've got three charts that will cover the three levels of pork production. So we've got 110%, minus 18%, and the national level carbon plan levels. So I've got a number of indicators that I could focus on. I can't give you all because there's not enough space on the screen for that. So we want to look at whether we are meeting the French needs in terms of pig and pork-based product consumption. So here we cover the needs. When you're in green, if you're in orange, then you drop below their needs, and we're no longer covering the actual needs for French consumers. So it makes quite sense. When you have 110% production levels, obviously you cover all needs, and that's what you have in the first two columns. However, when you reduce the covers, or when you reduce the level of pork actually being consumed by French, then obviously you end up in overproduction. Then we looked at the greenhouse gas emissions. You've got a 20% drop. So that's the third column, where you have a drop of 20% in overall consumption, and you have the high level of best environmental practices. That's the third column. And then on the final column, it's with 20% reduction of consumption and 50% organic farms. Moving on to this slide now, this is a negative 18% production. So French production doesn't cover French consumer needs. And that's what you can see quite clearly in the first two columns. However, in the two columns on the right, you can actually see that we do meet French consumer needs. We can also look at the greenhouse gas emissions. We can reduce it by 40% when you actually incorporate a drop in consumer practices and a strong increase in best practices. The difference between the first and second column, between the second and third columns, the reason that there is an environmental impact there is because you're no longer producing as much as what you need, therefore you have to import, and that import comes at a greenhouse gas emission cost. Here, what's interesting is that you have the same greenhouse gas emission impact for the first three columns. But that means you have a drop of minus 30% in overall production, and we no longer meet the French consumer needs. And in the final column, with organic farming, you actually reduce production by 60%, therefore 40% comes from imports. And again, your greenhouse gas emissions are only there at 10%, and it's because, unfortunately, you have everything being imported. So in terms of downstream, we saw that there were 20 slaughterhouses that were performing under capacity, 15% slaughter volumes, 3% that were actually over capacity. And this is predominantly in the area Centre-Val de Loire and Grand Est, so in the center of the France and over to the east of France. In terms of a drop production, there were 39 to 59 slaughterhouses that were struggling, and a quarter to half of overall slaughtering needs being met. So, to sum it up, it's very hard to reconcile issues with the climate, with carbon emissions, and societal needs and expectations. So if we want to try and respect the climate, but also meet our food sovereignty needs, then we definitely need a proper system of best practices, but that comes at a very high cost, up to 231 million euros in investment. Well, between 160 and 231 million euros in investment just to meet those environmental plan needs, with the drop in greenhouse gas emissions only going up to about 40%. Now, we actually need to meet the societal needs and climate needs, a drop of 20% consumption, a drop of 60% in production, and that means we're going to be depending on imports to about 45% of the total level, and we need the overall greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced by 14% if importing. Now, actually, a drop of 18% is actually going to have a major impact of our slaughterhouse capacity and needs. So that's why we're saying that there's not a linear relationship. It's more an issue of thresholds that we're going to have to meet. That's it for me. Thank you very much.